We'll break away here as the U.S. Senate gavels act in for procedural votes on the USA Freedom Act. Live coverage on C-SPAN 2.
To get a short-term extension of 3 provisions that will expire at midnight tonight. Section 215, business records, Section 206, roving wiretap authority, and the lone wolf provision. Unfortunately, those efforts were unsuccessful. The lone wolf and roving wiretap provisions, however, are not, I repeat, not, the subject of controversy with the House bill. So I would propose that we extend at least the lone wolf and the roving wiretap authorities while we continue to litigate the differing views on Section 215. More specifically, I would propose that we extend those 2 provisions, lone wolf and roving wiretaps, for up to 2 weeks. So, Mr. President, having said that, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of a bill, which is at the desk, to extend the expiring provisions related to lone wolf and roving wiretaps for 2 weeks, and that the bill be read a 3rd time and passed, the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
The senator from Kentucky.
Reserving the right to object, one of the promises that was given when the Patriot Act was originally passed was that in exchange for allowing a less than constitutional standard, we would only use these actions against the terrorists and against foreigners. We've found, though, that 99% of the time, Section 213 is being used for domestic crime.
Senator from Kentucky.
I believe that no section of the Patriot Act should be passed unless our targets are terrorists, not Americans. I object.
Objection is heard.
Last week, I proposed giving the Intelligence Committee the time it would need to work toward the kind of bipartisan legislative compromise Americans deserve. A compromise that would preserve important counterterrorism tools that are necessary to protect American lives. That effort was blocked. Just now, I proposed an even narrower extension that would have only extended some of the least controversial, but still critical tools to ensure they do not lapse as senators work toward a more comprehensive legislative outcome. But even that very narrow offer was blocked. I think it should be worrying for our country because the nature of the threat we face is very serious. It's aggressive, it's sophisticated, it's geographically dispersed, and it's not going away. As the LA Times reported, quote, the Obama administration has dramatically stepped up warnings of potential terrorist attacks on American soil after several years of relative calm. And the paper reported that this is occurring in the wake of FBI arrests of at least 30 Americans on terrorism-related charges this year in an array of lone wolf plots. So these aren't theoretical threats, Mr. President. It's not a theoretical threat. They're with us every day. We have to face up to them. We shouldn't be disarming unilaterally as our enemies grow more sophisticated and aggressive. And we certainly should not be doing so based on a campaign of demagoguery and disinformation launched in the wake of the unlawful actions of Edward Snowden, who was last seen in Russia. The opponents of this program have not been able to provide any examples of the NSA abusing the authorities provided under Section 215. And the record will show that there has, in fact, not been one documented instance of abuse of it. I think it's also important to remember that the content of calls are not captured. That's the general view, but it's an incorrect one. I'll say it again. The content of calls are not captured. I say to the American people, if you've been told that, that is not correct. That's what I mean about a campaign of disinformation. The only things in question are the number dialed, the number from which the call was made, the length of the call, and the date. That's it. That's it. Detailed oversight procedures have been put in place, too, in order to protect the privacy of Americans. Now, I believe this is a program that strikes a critical balance between privacy on the one hand and national security on the other. That doesn't mean the Senate still shouldn't have the opportunity to make some changes to it. That's precisely the outcome I'd been hoping to facilitate by seeking several short-term extensions. And considering all that's come to light about the House-passed bill in recent weeks, I believe this was more than reasonable. The administration's inability to answer even the most basic questions about the alternative bulk data system it would have to build under that legislation is, to say at the very least, pretty troubling. Pretty troubling. That's not just my view. That's the view of many in this body, including colleagues who've been favorably predisposed to the House bill. In particular, I know senators from both parties have been disturbed by the administration's continuing inability to guarantee whether the new system would work as well as the current one, or whether there would even be any data available to analyze. Because while the administration has let it be known that this non-existent system could only be built in time if telephone providers cooperate in building it, providers have made it abundantly clear that they're not going to commit to retaining the data. They're not going to commit to retaining the data for any period of time unless legally required to do so. And there's no such requirement in the House-passed bill. None at all. Here's how one provider put it. We're not prepared to commit to voluntarily retain documents for any particular period of time pursuant to the proposed U.S. Freedom Act, if not required by law. If not required by law. Quote, unquote. Now, these are just a few of the reasons I thought it was prudent to try and give the Senate more space to advance better legislation through committee consideration and regular order with input from both sides. But, my colleague, it is now clear that that will not be possible in the face of determined opposition from those who simply wish to end the counterterrorism program altogether. No time to try to improve the House-passed bill will be allowed because some would like to end the program altogether. So this is where we find ourselves. This is the reality. And so it essentially leaves us with two options. Option one, allow the program to expire altogether without attempting to replace it. That would mean disarming completely and arbitrarily based on a campaign of disinformation in the face of growing, aggressive, and sophisticated threats. Growing, aggressive, and sophisticated threats. That's a totally unacceptable outcome. Completely and totally unacceptable outcome. So we won't be doing that. And so we're left with option two. The House-passed bill. It's certainly not ideal. But along with votes on some modest amendments that attempt to ensure the program can actually work as promised, it's now the only realistic way forward. So I remain determined to continue working toward the best outcome for the American people possible under the circumstances. This is where we are, colleagues. A House-passed bill with some serious flaws, an inability to get a short-term extension to try to improve the House-passed bill in the way we would normally do this, through some kind of consultative process. So, bearing that in mind, I move to proceed to the motion to reconsider vote number 194, the vote by which cloture was not invoked on the motion to proceed to H.R. 2048.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Yeah, the motion is agreed to.
Mr. President, I move to reconsider the motion to invoke cloture on the motion to proceed to H.R. 2048.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to proceed to H.R. 2048, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to H.R. 2048, an act to reform the authorities of the federal government to require the production of certain business records, conduct electronic surveillance, use PIN registers and trap and trace devices, and use other forms of information gathering for foreign intelligence, counterterrorism, and criminal purposes, and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso.